The closing conference will be delivered by Professor Richard Whitman and will be moderated by Colonel Alberto Marinheiro.
Good afternoon. So we have to finish at 17:30 sharp because the professor has a plane to catch. So I'm passing right away to the presentation. Professor Richard Whitman is a visiting senior associate fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and director of the Global Europe Center and professor of political at international relations at the University of Kent. His current research interests includes Brexit and especially the future foreign and security and defense policies of the EU and the UK, and the governance and future priorities of the EU. He is the author and editor of 10 books and published over 60 articles and book chapters. In 2016, he was a senior fellow for the ESRC's UK in a Changing Europe program. He is a visiting senior associate fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, an academic fellow of the European Policy Center, and an academician of the Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Whitman is a regular international media commentator. Recent coverage has included BBC Radio and Television, Sky, ITV, CNN, Bloomberg, CNBC, and he has been quoted by print publications including the Financial Times, Newsweek, Reuters, International Herald Tribune, and the Wall Street Journal. He has given evidence to the UK Parliament on the UK and EU foreign and security issues. Professor Whitman.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Institute and to the Director for the invitation. Thank you very much for all of the hospitality. Thank you very much for arranging weather this morning that I could recognize with fog. And more than anything else, thank you for your concern with the UK. And with the issue of Brexit. I'd be very happy to continue the conversation after this event through Twitter, so please send me a message for those of you who are inclined to do so. But what I want to do this afternoon really is to perhaps look at the challenge that the UK faces and for us then to reflect what the consequences are for Britain's place in the world and how Britain might think about its place in the world, but also to think about how the UK is going to go about thinking about its place in the world, if that's not too complicated, and where we might see the UK-EU relationship heading, especially in the area of foreign security and defence policy. And I think I should probably declare at the beginning that I've probably been on a journey since 23rd of June this year, and my adjustment is that Brexit is happening. There is no going back, there's no second referendum, and really for third parties, third countries and so on, it's a good time to start thinking about how you might want to relate to the UK, both through the Article 50 negotiation process, but also beyond. And perhaps it's worth thinking about the challenge that the UK faces and to express this in fairly straightforward fashion. The UK is about to go through a process which is not a sensible process. Those of you who are familiar with computer systems will know that changing hardware is a problem, changing software is a problem, changing the hardware and the software at the same time is a recipe for disaster. And the UK is about to do both of those things. So we might expect there'll be some glitches along the way, but I want to use this as a kind of organizing idea for part of my presentation, and I hope that it will make sense. But first, I don't know whether you can see this drawing. This drawing is by a political cartoonist called James Gilray. Political cartooning in the late 17th, early 18th century was an art form, but it was also one in which people used to draw things that frankly you can't show to a public audience anymore. This is one of his more delicate drawings, shall we say. I'm sure that you recognize the guy on this side here, Napoleon, possibly not the other character, William Pitt the Younger, who is a prime minister, and his house was at Chatham House. This is an interesting drawing because if you see the resolution, you'll see that Napoleon is carving off the continent of Europe for himself, and the UK is taking the rest of the world. Now, what's instructive about this was a moment in which Britain was thinking that perhaps it could turn its back on the continent. What happened shortly after this was drawn was that Britain involved itself in an overseas deployment for the Peninsular War. So the UK, even at those moments in which it may think that it has an alternative to engagement with the continent and with its nearest neighbours, is very quickly pulled back into some kind of reality. And that's been a perennial story in Britain's relationship with the continent, but also Britain's relationship with the world outside. And whatever moment we're going to enter into, or whatever the 2-year process of Article 50 is concerned, the UK will find itself inextricably linked to the EU, inextricably linked to the continent of Europe. So we need to think a bit beyond Article 50. We need to start thinking perhaps imaginatively about the way in which the UK and the EU will relate together. And this is not an unusual moment for the UK, in the sense the UK has made structural adjustments in the past. It made an adjustment with the loss of empire, the post-imperial process, which conveniently coincided with the end of the Second World War. So for the UK, it didn't notice perhaps so much that it had lost an empire as much as it otherwise might have done. It made an adjustment in the post-Cold War period, so it's been through 2 major structural readjustments since the end of the Second World War. And therefore, Brexit might be viewed in those kind of terms, and that order challenge for the UK. And in each of those circumstances, the UK thought quite big about how it might relate to the world outside. But one of the things you do see when you look at the UK is that there's a high degree of continuity in the institutions that the UK has used to conduct its foreign security and defence policy. The hardware has remained fairly static, but that's about to change. But there have been 2 key aspects for the UK which have perennially haunted Britain's foreign and security policy. It's a key tension for Britain since the Second World War. And why it's important for us now is that both of those issues have a question mark against them at the same time. So Britain has really wrestled with the problem of how, on the one hand, to deal with its relationship with the United States, and how, on the other, to deal with its relationship with the continent of Europe, and particularly the European integration process. Wrestling with both of those have been really the 2, or the magnetic north and south, for Britain's foreign and security policy. We're now at a moment in which Britain is about to change its relationship with the continent, and at the same time there is a question mark against its relationship with the United States. So those 2 beasts, the rock and the hard place, the Skylar and Sherbalist that Britain has dealt with in the past, both of which have thrown up dangers for the UK, tacking too much to one side or tacking to the other. Both of those are questioned now and at the same moment. So really for the UK, it's in a sort of moment of maximum anxiety, I would suggest, in terms of its outlook and its perspective and in the uncertainty that it faces in its relationship with the world outside itself. But all discussions, absolutely all discussions about Britain's place in the world always start with Churchill. It is an iron law of discussion of Britain's foreign security and defence policy. And as you'll probably be aware, that Churchill's idea that Britain really had to balance, on the one hand, its relationship with Europe, its relationship with Empire and Commonwealth, and its relationship with the English-speaking world, meaning the United States. You open any textbook on British foreign policy, and Churchill will be there on the first page. And it's no surprise that if you follow the Brexit debate and the post-June vote, that there have been public discussions about the relationship between the UK and the Commonwealth, the relationship between the UK and the US, and a bit of thinking about the way in which the UK relates to a future integration process. So those are absolutely sort of basic starting points for the way that UK thinks about its relationship with the world outside. But there have also been other competing visions. And really, what I think we want to think about is, so what's going to be attractive for the UK as it exits the EU? What are going to be the key reference points? Well, for the UK, it has been always the case that it's been concerned to be the indispensable partner to the United States. So no surprise, Theresa May's first significant overseas visit was to meet President Trump. We now have a state visit in prospect to the UK with President Trump. But this is now potentially a very different United States. So how will the UK relate to the indispensable partner? Will that be an attractive vision for the UK, tacking even more closely to the United States than it has done in the past? But the UK is, at the same time, a middle power. It isn't a superpower, even if it was in the bracket of countries that were considered to be superpowers when the phrase was first articulated by T.H. Fox in 1944. It isn't a microstate or a small state. In terms of its resources, its capabilities, and its ambitions, it sits somewhere between the kind of systemic changes and those states who arguably have interests which is essentially focused on their neighbourhood. And that's an uncomfortable position to be for a state, because you can perhaps overextend yourself in terms of the thing that you try to do, or the argument is made, and this is certainly made by those who are arguing leave in the referendum campaign, that the UK has limited its ambition, and limited its ambition as a consequence of its membership of the EU. The only thing I think we're certain about in terms of where the UK is heading and where it's looking or thinking about ideas is detachment from the EU. There has been a major shift over the last 6 months on the part of the diplomatic, securocrat, think tank and other community in the UK. Politicians are taking a bit longer to adjust. In the UK is going somewhere else. So there is now a market for ideas, and a market for ideas as to where that somewhere else might actually be. To put it in different terms, the UK is changing the operating system that runs the hardware, and it isn't quite sure yet what that operating system should have in terms of its key principles and what should drive the system. But there is a problem to overcome before the UK can think about how it might organise and reconfigure its thinking for life after Brexit. And that, of course, is negotiating out the relationship with the other member states and with the EU itself, which has been the subject of our discussion this evening. And this is where the UK, today rather, and this is where the UK has already been fiddling with the hardware. You know, it's already retooled its civil service to create what we call DexEU, very horrible configuration, the Department for Exiting the European Union, a ministry devoted or created for the express purpose of negotiating exit. To equip that ministry, we've stripped people out of the Foreign Office. And one of the things that the ambassador didn't say this morning is that the UK Foreign Office has been significantly denuded to facilitate Brexit negotiations. We've also created a new department for international trade, which is intended to prepare the UK for a trade policy post-exit from the EU. But there's some stuff that doesn't quite fit in terms of the structure. One is how the devolved administrations, read Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and the British Overseas Territories, which were mentioned in the previous section with a reference to Gibraltar. And also Parliament, where Parliament fits in, what Parliament's role is going to be in the process of negotiating Brexit. This is a system which is being created from scratch in just over 6 months, and a system which is only now starting to come on stream, and obviously officially comes on stream tomorrow once we have the Article 50 negotiation. But there is a lot of politics and bureaucratic politics in this system. And sitting at its centre, and the Prime Minister has placed herself right in the centre of this system, which goes to a key characteristic, a key aspect of continuity in Britain's place in the world, which is that British foreign policy since the Second World War has been predominantly driven by Prime Ministers and their advisors rather than by the Foreign Office, and certainly not by Parliament, certainly not by parties, and most certainly not by the public. So even if the public or the public is divided in terms of remain or leave, there is no significant track record in publics driving British foreign policy. The exception, of course, and this is a very significant exception, is having a referendum and the public deciding that the UK's foreign policy orientation should be dramatically reorientated. So perhaps there'll be a lesson learned there. We'll have to wait and see. So we've got elements of change in terms of the hardware, creating this new infrastructure for negotiating Brexit, which potentially creates a significant order problem for the UK in the use of its diplomatic bandwidth, the use of its civil service and administrative capability, and we have to wait and see whether the system can bear the strain. And this is a system which has undergone significant shrinkage as a consequence of 2008 financial crisis and reduced staffing. So the Foreign Office, for example, has double-digit cuts, has had double-digit year-on-year cuts, and now has 10% less staff than it did 10 years ago. But, and this was part of the ambassador's presentation this morning, and it should be, of course, because her job is also to promote Britain's strengths. If the UK is exiting in terms of some of the assets that it has, some of the hardware that it has significant capabilities, and we've talked about these today in terms of things that the UK might be potentially losing or are lost to the EU. Its diplomatic resources, which are significant, if I think somewhat under-resourced. Its network and memberships and network of key organisations. We've touched on these in terms of UN Security Council. It'll be interesting to see how the UK approaches the Commonwealth in the future. But the UK is certainly going to be far more active in both NATO and the UN system over the next couple of years to compensate for any sense that it might be losing or potentially losing its capacity for influence. Military capability and deployments is a very interesting area, because one of the things we haven't touched on today so far is the way that the UK is actually ramping up its defence spend and its capability spend. You know, in the next 2 years, the UK will have the first of its QE2 carriers will launch, which will spend their time predominantly in warmer waters. They will, their two carriers are designed to fly the F-35B variant of the Lightning II, which will give the UK much more significant capability in terms of basically having carrier capacity, which it hasn't got now. There's also the spend commitment in terms of the successor weapons platform for the Trident system, nuclear defence system, the Dreadnought submarines. And there are a whole raft of commitments in terms of basically making the UK forces much more agile. And all of these are predicated on a significant ongoing spend, both in terms of R&D, but also in terms of the defence budget. Development aid, again, has also been touched on. I think it's an important point to make that the UK and this 0.7% GMP commitment is here to stay, but the UK will be looking at ways in which it can recycle that money. So the money that it draws back from the EDF, it'll also be looking to spend and carry on spending. So that development fund spending that's going through the EU is potentially now going to be going out in terms of a national spend. And there are other assets, but they are arguably problematic. You know, the political economy, and particularly the City of London for the UK, which has acted as a form of influence for the UK. There are real question marks about how that will work for the UK in the future, and particularly whether the UK wants to move towards a more deregulated approach towards the City of London. And there are questions about the UK's soft power and how the UK is going to use and deploy soft power. And it's worth noticing, I think, that one of the real major targets now for the UK over the next little while is defence diplomacy. And it's trying to put together the perception of the capability that it has in the defence sphere together with defence diplomacy to give it some kind of additional advantage in terms of its place in the world. That, in a sense, is what the ambassador was saying in terms of the UK is not losing these kinds of capabilities. But of course, they just provide a set of resources that sit there for the UK, which are only usable in a context in which the UK really isn't spending all of its time worrying about and negotiating with the other EU member states, which I say is going to be a major preoccupation for the UK. And although we've spoken about Article 50 and the triggering of Article 50, the UK has a whole set of things that it needs to do to accommodate its exit from the EU. And these are going to be the first order preoccupations for the UK for the next couple of years. The legal separation from the EU, the legacy, how it's going to deal with the legacy. Some kind of interim agreement, which is absolutely crucial, I think, for the UK. The final status agreement it reaches with the EU, which is some kind of free trade agreement with a flanking agreement on immigration policy and movement of people and the conditions for that. An agreement or set of agreements in the area of foreign, defence and security policies. All of those are areas that the UK will need to negotiate out with the EU and the other member states. And simultaneously, of course, to regularise its situation within the WTO as it leaves the common commercial policy, and to create new free trade agreements with third countries as it leaves the common commercial policy. The UK already has an approach in all of these areas. It is already quite far down the road of working out how all of these things are going to be organised. So, the idea that the UK might backtrack, particularly on the customs union and the common commercial policy, is a low probability proposition. I would suggest. So where does this leave the UK in terms of its European diplomacy? So it's got to negotiate out its exit from the EU, but what does it want? What does it want in terms of its relationship with the other member states beyond the trade relationship? Well, the UK's been on a super quick journey through a whole series of options in the last few years. I think it's been through a position which was described very nicely, I think, in the first session today, sort of outside a super EU, hardcore, whatever you want to call it, not in the monetary union and so on, but trying to hang on in there in terms of influence. The proposition that might lead a kind of EEA or EFTA tier within Europe, I think, is disappearing as a desired outcome on the part of the EU. The only way to describe it, and there was a very nice reference to the American Civil War this morning, is, in a sense, the UK wants to be the Confederacy. It will revel in the idea of being the Confederacy. Not that it's going to enslave me, I hope, as a worker within the UK, but in the sense that, articulating a different model of what it means to be a European state. That it isn't just about being a member of the European Union. And there will be a high degree of what I would call promiscuous bilateralism. The UK is going to be very, very interested in all sorts of ways in which it can strike bilateral relationships with other member states outside the sphere of the treaties, and we're already seeing early indications of this with the defence agreement that's soon to be signed with Germany, that the UK is going to work quite hard at reinvigorating some of the bilateral relationships, including the relationship with Portugal. I would say that it's neglected probably since the early 2000s. So the UK leaves the other member states to address their own problems, but of course there are also problems for the UK in terms of being the most significant market for the EU. And there's a paradox, I think, in the position of many UK Eurosceptics that they now have a strong desire for the EU to move towards political union and certainly to see a political union underpinning economic and monetary union because they don't want to worry about the EU. So what might the UK strategy be? And this is where we could start to think about what and the process by which the UK is going to think through how it might want to prepare for its life post-exit, and also where third parties can start to think about the process in which they might want to influence the way the UK thinks about the world outside. Key document for the UK is its or process is the Strategic Defence and Security Review and the National Security Strategy, which is in place. If you read that document, what's interesting is that it chimes entirely with the EU global strategy. All the things the UK worries about are all the things that the EU worries about. And of course, that should be the case because the UK is a member of the EU and obviously involved in the process of the global strategy. So we might be heartened by the idea that the threat perception and security anxieties are identical between the EU and the UK. The only problem is if you read those documents, the EU does not feature very prominently. So there is a question that the UK will have to answer for itself as to what it wants. Foreign Office and DFID both operating under these under plans that take it through to 2020, as does the security strategy. And the UK in the past, when it's had these processes, has been open to external consultation. It sought third parties to offer their views as to what it thinks the UK's future security strategy should be. So there's an opportunity there for diplomats and third parties to work on this. But the underpinning idea, if you hadn't realised already, in fact, I don't think the ambassador used it this morning, is the idea of global Britain. This is the new mantra, it's the new hashtag to describe Britain's place in the world. The only problem is that it is an idea in search of content. And that's really where there is an ongoing public debate. And if we just think about that for a moment, there is obviously, for global Britain, a question as to how it's going to relate to the EU. But there's also a question how the EU is going to fit in its understanding of how it relates to the world outside. And I want us just for a moment to think a little bit about the way in which Britain's European diplomacy might evolve. There's been a high degree of consistency since Britain joined the EU, irrespective of whether it's been a Conservative or Labour government, as to what they've sought from the European Union. Once the UK exits the EU, so further down the line, some of those elements of consistency in Britain's policy may start to change. For example, if the UK is outside the single market, it will almost certainly be much more ambivalent about the single market itself. It'll probably start to think about the single market as a terrible idea because, of course, it will potentially exclude British exporters. It will see it's got all this red tape and so on and so on. On international trade, probably be much more hostile to the EU as an actor within international trade because potentially that is to the disadvantage of the UK in terms of the EU's capacity to strike trade deals. And it may become more ambivalent on the question of enlargement, for example, because enlargement suggests a larger European Union, less opportunity for the UK to develop bilateral relations, so on. I leave that for your consideration and perhaps concern in terms of the way that the UK's European diplomacy may shift and may go through a transition in the period between now and when it leaves, and then question marks for the period after that. But the UK also faces a two-union problem. There is the Union, the European Union, and there is the Union of the United Kingdom, which we've already touched on. And what is likely to be a major order concern for the UK, as already demonstrated by the kind of things the Prime Minister has been doing, is to hold the Union of the United Kingdom together, not just Scotland, but also the place of Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom, at the same time as trying to address the question of the European Union. In this area, I think there is likely to be the greatest difficulty for the UK government, unquestionably. And that's partly a consequence of the way the UK has voted, but it's also the way that the UK hasn't created the machinery really to deal with the devolution settlement. Because the other thing to consider is that when the UK joined the EU in 1973, it hadn't had a process of political devolution. As it starts to repatriate powers back from the EU, some of those areas, such as agriculture, for example, energy, are powers which are intended to be held by the devolved administrations. There is no agreement as to how that repatriation takes place. So therein is a much more interesting struggle, I would suggest to you, than the question of independence or not for Scotland, because that's where the politics is likely to be. So we have Brexit, and we have the Brexit process, but it's quite possible, of course, for the UK that all sorts of things are going to derail the UK and to derail the UK's approach to Brexit. Not just domestic issues, what happens to public opinion as the negotiations unfold, what happens to the British economy, What happens to the party system in the UK? We essentially now have a cleaved society, but we don't have political parties that map onto that. What's going to happen in terms of the devolved administrations and the electoral cycle, that Theresa May will almost certainly face a general election on the back of the prospect of the UK leaving the EU. And externally, and we haven't touched too much actually on the external outside Europe today. You know, we're going through a system reshaping process. We're going through a process in which we can identify perhaps more systemic instability than stability, both in the neighbourhood and beyond. And how far is that going to draw the UK back in rather than sort of repel the UK from the EU as it thinks about the EU as a problem solver rather than a problem setter for the UK. And Northern Ireland is absolutely crucial, will be an absolutely crucial issue where you get an overlap between, for the UK, the domestic and the international. Final 2 minutes. How might the UK then plug into the common foreign security and defence policy and the common security and defence policy in the future? In other words, the subset of the wider relationship with the EU, which we might want to separate out or think about differently because we may be more optimistic about the prospect for collaboration in this area. I think there are 3 models available. One is for the UK to remain integrated. One is the UK to remain associated. One is for the UK to be detached. Each one of those is difficult, and actually the integration one is probably the most difficult to build. And if you take a look at, and I apologise for the resolution here, those 3 options. At the top is what the UK already has in terms of EU membership. Second row across is what it means to be an integrated player. Essentially, the EU is going to have to create or think about a relationship with a country of a configuration that it's never had previously. I would characterise this as a problem which is conveyed or expressed with the idea of electrical adapters. You know, for anybody from the UK coming to the continent or vice versa, you have to have an adapter. We need or will need to find an adapter that will allow a non-member state to plug into the EU system if we want to have a very integrated UK. And there are all sorts of advantages to the UK being integrated that we can pick up on. Being an associated partner is probably unattractive for the UK because the models of association that we already have in the CFSP, CSDP are likely for the UK to look and feel like a light beer, you know, in the American sense of a light beer, LITE, that abomination. It's one of the things that really we should hold Americans to account for, destroying beer and the taste of beer. But that's likely to be unpalatable for the UK, I would suggest. So the danger is we may slip into a situation in which the UK is a detached observer. So I think there's a lot of work is going to have to go into an area, even where there is a very strong overlap and coincidence of interest, to get the plumbing right or to get the connectors working. The problem with all of this is that there was no decent preparing of the ground. This is true, obviously, for Brexit in general, but if you look at foreign security and defence policy, no real substantive discussion of those issues in the referendum, particularly the alternative. So the UK is unprepared for the kind of order of thinking that it needs to go through, and its politicians are certainly going through a sort of a lag, I think, in terms of what they need to do. And there's a danger for the UK that Europe, meaning European Union, becomes a substitute for thinking about broader foreign policy issues. In other words, starts to think about its relationship with the world outside purely in terms of its relationship with the EU, which is bad for both sides, I would suggest, because it's the negotiation is going to be technical, testy and difficult, and have the potential to pollute the areas in which there is should be cooperation. And for the UK itself, a real and significant problem is that there isn't really a cross-party consensus. There isn't an elite consensus as to what the UK might actually be seeking and searching to do, not just in its relationship with the EU, but also with the world outside. And for all of the reasons that we've discussed today, the ways in which the UK is important in terms of the neighbourhood that we find ourselves in, that's not a good place for a state to find itself in, I would suggest. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So I just have a short 15 minutes debate period, please. I just want to take the first three questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, when you refer to this absence of a cross-party consensus on what would Britain wishes to have after Brexit, together with the fact that, you know, the world of relations which intends to build externally, it's a complex and interdependent world. So if you cannot, you will meet into two different types of diversity, let's say, a domestic diversity and an international one. And on the other hand, what does the UK looks for outside the EU, let's say in Commonwealth, find within the EU? Besides free trade arrangements, more freedom to economically choose its ways, also politically, of course. But what are the visible gains in going back to this idea of a global Britain within Commonwealth and beyond that you can find in the EU?
Katarina.
Thank you. I was very interested in an idea that I thought I understand correctly. When you mentioned that Brexiteers would now favor a more integrated European Union to make sure that the UK would not come back to a sort of relationship with continental Europe. Could you develop that idea further? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the questions. Maybe to take the second one first, in terms of it's a curious thing that there are many paradoxes in the Eurosceptic worldview, and one of the paradoxes is this idea that basically integration is good for others, and it's. The problem with the European Union is not the UK in the European Union. The problem is essentially that the European Union hasn't been able to build the institutions which are necessary to basically make economic and monetary union function. And you know, it certainly since June, I've heard it articulated over and over again by some of the more prominent Eurosceptics within the Conservative Party that the opportunity is there now for the other member states, now the UK has left, which has had, as they would see it, all sorts of legitimate concerns in terms of the EU legal order in particular, that they can crack on with doing this unencumbered by the UK. Because, of course, if you remember one of David Cameron's goals in the negotiation, if you remember that far back, in terms of his renegotiation deal, was to remove the UK from a formal commitment to ever closer union. So that's quite totemic for the Conservative Party. But of course, it then puts the UK in an interesting position over the next 2 years in terms of the things that it would like to see. And at the same time, of course, it still wants to play a role in what the shape and function of the EU might look and feel like. But whether that's unrealistic, I would leave you to judge. On the question about competing models, I think what's interesting, and perhaps isn't entirely appreciated elsewhere, is how much energy and effort the UK has been putting into developing its geopolitical footprint outside Europe. You know, it's gone back on a key idea which was invoked in the 1960s, that there would be no permanent British bases east of Suez. It's now set up a permanent base in Bahrain, HMS Jafar, which is where it's envisaged the QE2 carrier and a carrier, a kind of baby carrier battle group will exist for the UK. It's now seeking to set up a network of, in effect, arrangements to internally and externally to allow the UK to have much more of an engaged defence diplomacy with armed forces elsewhere. And one of the things that I think is absolutely certain, and you're going to hear a lot more of, and was touched on in the last session very well, is the relationship with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. You know, the UK is already locked in as a consequence of Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing agreement. It's already part of the five-power defence agreement that gives it a sort of commitment to be involved more heavily in Asia. And the carriers are basically designed to be interoperable with countries other than European countries. You know, those carriers have been built to carry US aircraft, not other European aircraft. They don't have cats and traps, therefore short takeoff and landing aircraft. They're designed really to be interoperable with forces like the Australian armed forces as well as American armed forces. And I can just see that one of the attractions for the UK is going to be spending more time in warmer waters. If you follow the sort of economic news, there is now a major trade delegation from Qatar in London this week, huge delegation, which is coming and basically is already committed to major investments in the UK. The UK is looking to the Gulf in a way to plug any holes that may exist in terms of investment, either lost or not coming from continental Europe. So, you know, things have already moved on quite quickly, I think, in terms of a sort of posture that thinks about the UK as paddling in warmer waters. So, and of course, sorry, just to finish on that, that's why the idea of early stage trade agreements have been floated with Canada, New Zealand and Australia. And what goes alongside that for many on the right of the Conservative Party is an argument that they share the same legal system, they share the same political philosophy. And actually, if you look at those group of countries as a share of world trade, for example, they see them as being having the potential for the third or fourth largest trade bloc internationally. So more cooperation in trade policy, for example.
One more question. Well, thank you for me. So it's hard work to try to summarize this kind of a seminar. It's a kind of strange feeling. I came here this morning full of doubts. I have an excellent and comprehensive seminar, and I come out with more doubts than I entered this morning. And I have to thank the conferences, the lecturers for that. Thank you very much, Professor Whitman. Thank you all. With the permission of the director, I close the seminar. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.